Good morning, guys. I have here a 2GR-FE 3.5 liter V6 engine out of this 2007 Lexus RX 350. Now I've dropped the entire engine and cradle and everything in order to replace the exhaust variable valve timing gear, because as you can see, this thing is coming apart. So at this point in the job, I'm ready to remove the timing chains, remove the intake and exhaust gears, and of course I'll have to reassemble it all with new parts. So if you're trying to figure out how to set the timing on one of these 2GR-FE motors, you've come to the right video, because I'm going to show you everything, including torque specs, and I'm going to explain the timing marks in a way that should make sense. So let's get into it. So really quickly before we begin, I need you to understand why I'm here doing this job in the first place. What happened was we ended up pulling the valve cover on bank 2 right here in the front in order to do some work, replace the valve cover gasket. And that's when we looked down and we noticed that the collar on the exhaust VVT gear is actually coming out of the sprocket. Now this is very dangerous because the timing cover sits right here, and eventually this collar will come out enough to where it will wedge in between the gear and the timing cover, and when that happens, you can say goodbye to this engine because it will not survive that. Now we just happened to notice this before any damage was caught, thankfully. But of course, in order to fix this, the entire engine has to come out. And when we removed the rear valve cover for bank 1, we noticed that this exhaust gear is starting to have the same problem. Also, when we first had the valve cover off, when the engine was still in the vehicle, we did find some pieces of a timing chain guide that were down in there. And that broken piece actually came from, if you notice right here, the tensioner for the secondary chain. You see how it's got a guide, a plastic guide here, and it's got a plastic guide on the bottom. This is for bank 1 in the rear. But if you notice over here on bank 2, the top has the guide in place, but the bottom, you'll be able to see better in a little bit when I get this apart, but that guide has completely broken and is missing. So those were the missing pieces we found. So step 1 in disassembling this timing chain is we need to set the engine where cylinder 1 is at top dead center on the compression stroke. Now if the engine is in the car and you open the hood, the first thing you're going to see is actually bank 2, which contains cylinders 2, 4, and 6. And then on the back side by the firewall is going to be bank 1 that contains cylinders 1, 3, and 5. So bank 1 is in the rear, bank 2 is in the front. Bank 1 contains cylinder 1, always remember that. Bank 1 is also called the right side of the motor, and bank 2 is called the left side of the motor. Now that may be confusing to some people, because when you're standing in front of the engine looking at it, this is the left side and that's the right side. So why is it backwards? Well, that's because you always have to remember that on a vehicle, left and right is determined from sitting in the driver's seat. So theoretically, if this engine were sitting in the engine bay in a non-transverse fashion, in other words, if the actual front of the engine here was facing toward the radiator or toward the front of the car, then if you're back here sitting in the driver's seat, this would be the left side, that would be the right side. Therefore, bank 1 is right, bank 2 is left. Now you may say, why don't they just call it driver side or passenger side? Well, that's because all over the world you have left-hand drive cars and you have right-hand drive cars. So just simply calling it driver side or passenger side, it really doesn't work. It's better to say right or left. That way, whether your car is a right-hand drive or left-hand drive, left is still left and right is still right. The reason you guys need to know this is because in a lot of repair manuals, rather than saying bank 1 or bank 2, it'll just simply say right or left side. So you guys need to know that. Okay, now that we have an understanding of that, what we want to do is we want to take the crank pulley bolt. We want to reinsert it and thread it into the crankshaft all the way. Okay, now we're not tightening this bolt, we're just threading it in by hand so that we can get a 22mm socket on the bolt. That way we can rotate the crankshaft. Okay, now go ahead and remove all 6 of the spark plugs if you haven't done so already. That way the crankshaft is easier to turn and you're not fighting the compression of the engine. Now we're going to come over here to cylinder number 1. Now we need to set this at top dead center on the compression stroke. So the piston has to be all the way to the top of its travel, but it has to be on the compression stroke. Now when this piston is all the way at the top, it's either going to be on the compression stroke or it's going to be on the exhaust stroke. So how do we figure out which is which? All I'm going to do is very simple. I'm going to take a rubber glove like this. I'm going to slide one of the fingers of the rubber glove over the spark plug tube. So just like this. Now if I'm on the exhaust stroke and the piston is coming up, all the gases inside the cylinder are going to escape out of the exhaust valve, so it's not going to build up any pressure. Whereas on the compression stroke, the intake and exhaust valves are closed. So when I rotate the crank and the piston is coming up, it's going to build up pressure and it's going to blow this glove off. Now you can also place your hand over the spark plug tube while you're spinning the engine over, and when you start to feel pressure with your hand, that's how you know you're on the compression stroke. I'm just using a glove because it's easy to see on camera. See, I just rotated the engine a little bit and it sucked part of that glove inside the tube, so we are definitely not on compression quite yet. There. You see that? So we're on the compression stroke officially. Okay, at this point, I need the piston to be all the way at the top of its travel. Due to the fact that it just started building compression, I know the piston is still toward the bottom, so I need it to be all the way at the top. So I'm gonna take a long screwdriver like this. This is a Phillips head. I'm gonna put it down inside the tube. I'm gonna set it on top of the piston. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue rotating the engine clockwise, and I'll be able to see the screwdriver coming up. Once it finally stops coming all the way up, and then almost right before when it starts going back down, that's when I know I'm all the way at the very top. Just be very careful doing this while you're spinning the engine over. Make sure that if you feel any resistance, definitely stop, because you don't want to damage the piston or the cylinder walls with the screwdriver, but if you're careful, it'll be okay. Okay, now I'm going to hold the screwdriver straight with my hand. Now as I continue rotating the crank, you can watch it. And you see that it's coming up. And I'm just going to continue to rotate the crank until it stops. Got to keep going a little bit more. About right there. So I rotated the crank a tiny bit more and it did not continue to go up. So we are pretty much here at the top of our travel. So we are at top dead on the compression stroke on cylinder 1. Now, as soon as the screwdriver stops moving up, you actually can rotate the crankshaft still just a little bit more without the piston coming down. Because if you think about it, the connecting rod is connected to the crankshaft. So when it's all the way at the top, then when you continue rotating the crankshaft, the connecting rod has to move over like that a little bit before it starts going down. You can continue spinning it just a little bit after you get all the way to the very top to get the timing marks to line up. Okay, now before continuing, we need to understand something very important here about these intake and exhaust VVT gears. Bank 1 and Bank 2 are the exact same part numbers. These intake gears are the same part numbers, and these exhaust gears are the same part numbers. Now what this means is that each intake gear and each exhaust gear, they contain timing marks for Bank 1 and Bank 2. So each gear is going to have multiple marks, because you could theoretically put the gears in whatever position. You could put the intake gear for Bank 2 on Bank 1 and vice versa, and you could put the exhaust gear for Bank 2 on Bank 1 and vice versa. So with that in mind, let's come over here to Bank 1 and let's look and see what we have here. Okay, the exhaust gear has 2 marks on it. There's a single line here and a double line down here. This single line is for Bank 1. This double line is for Bank 2. Right now, we're on the Bank 1 side. So we need the single line for Bank 1 to line up with this notch right here on the cam cap. Now you may notice if you look at it that it's not perfectly aligned, and that's actually okay. Even in the factory repair manual, it states that the lines will not perfectly align, but they should be pretty close. So as you can see, this is good right here. If you come over here to the Bank 2 side, remember, this gear is the same part number as the other one, right? So it's going to have a mark for Bank 1 and it's going to have a mark for Bank 2. But now we're over here on the Bank 2 side. So what we need is the double mark for Bank 2 to line up with the mark on the cam cap that's right back there. And as you can see, they're lined up. Now let's come back over to Bank 1 and let's look at the intake gear this time. As you can see, looking back there on the cam cap, there is a little notch right there. And what we're trying to line up with that mark is the timing mark for Bank 1 that's on this gear. So if you come all the way down over here, you'll notice that double mark with the 2 lines right there. That's for bank 2. We're not on bank 2, we're on bank 1, so we can ignore that. For bank 2, you would look for these 2 lines, and the timing mark closest to those 2 lines is this thick arrow looking thing right here. That's for bank 2, but we're not on bank 2, so we need to come and look for the marks on bank 1, which is this single line right here. To the left of that single line, right here, directly above this bolt, is the timing mark for bank 1. So this is the timing mark. It's to the left of this indicator for bank 1, and it's to the right of the bank 2 timing mark. So this one right here needs to line up, or at least come pretty close to lining up with that notch on the cam cap back there. So as you can see, we're pretty close to it, so we're good over here. Now let's come over to the intake gear on bank 2. Now remember, this intake gear and that intake gear, they're the exact same part number, so they're gonna have the same marking, same everything. And as you can see, this double mark is our indicator for bank 2. To the right of that is our timing mark for bank 2, which is this kind of thick looking arrow mark. Now that mark right here, if you follow it straight back, it's pretty much in a straight line with this mark on the cam cap. So we're good for bank 2. Our timing mark for bank 1 is not needed over here, so don't worry about this. Timing mark for bank 1, timing mark for bank 2. Here you can get a good look of the timing marks. The bank 1 timing mark right underneath the chain is a thinner line. The bank 2 timing mark that's on our left side here is a lot wider and thicker. This mark right here is just made to say that, hey, the timing mark closest to this is for bank 1, and then these 2 lines over here is just meant to say, hey, the timing mark closest to these 2 lines is for bank 2. At this point, we can go ahead and remove the timing chain. These colored links, don't worry about those, because those are not important until you reassemble the chain and go to put it back on. But when you're just disassembling it, you don't have to worry about the colored links. They don't matter at this point. And the same goes for the secondary chains, because the secondary chains have colored links as well. But when you're just simply disassembling, don't worry about those. All you want to do is, like I said, get cylinder 1 on top dead of the compression stroke, and that's all you got to do for now. First, let's remove the 2 10mm bolts holding the timing chain tensioner in place. Now, if you're reusing this timing chain tensioner, you're going to want to go ahead and retract the tensioner so you can put it on later. So as you can see, it's got a locking pawl that prevents you from pushing it back in unless you move this little tab up, open it up, and then you can push it back in like that. And then when it's closed, I'm going to take a little pin, put it in the hole, and that should keep it in for now. Okay, now this guide right here can be removed. It just comes straight out. And there are some pretty deep groove marks in this guide, so it'll probably need to be replaced. Okay, next there's 2 12mm bolts that hold this chain damper in place, or this chain guide. So let's go ahead and remove these. Take this guide out of the way. Kind of the same thing. There's some deep groove marks in here, so we'll probably need to replace this one. Okay, now there should be enough slack at the chain at this point to remove the chain and kind of just set it up here on top of the crank. You'll notice back here on the reluctor wheel there is a dot right there, and that is a timing mark. It's just kind of an extra timing mark so you can make sure that you guys are on. And that dot right there, if you draw an imaginary line straight up, it's supposed to intersect with that indentation that's on the engine block right there. This one is not really a timing mark that's super important, but it is there. Next, I'm going to pull off the primary chain starting from over here on the bank 2 side. The reason I'm starting on this side is because you notice on this exhaust gear, it's got a flat side on either side, one here and one here. And so due to this side of the gear being a little bit flat, it allows you to remove the chain from the intake gear like so. See, I've removed it. If you notice over here, on the bank 2 side, the flat spot is up here and down here. So there may not be enough space to pull this chain out without rotating these gears. So we'll do that in just a little bit. But for now, continue to get the chain off. These guides right here at this point can be removed. They just pull straight out. They fit onto these little studs here. Here's one, here's two. And these two pieces are identical and they can only go on one way. This idler gear right here, there's really no need to mess with it, so I'm just gonna leave it alone. We're gonna have to rotate these gears to where this flat spot right here on the exhaust cam is over here. That way we have enough room to get the chain out. So we'll use a 17mm socket and we'll grab a hold of one of these bolts. Now before we start rotating these gears, you may be wondering, well hey, because the timing chain is off and the crank isn't turning, if we turn the cams, isn't that going to cause the valves and the pistons to contact each other and cause some damage? And the answer to that is actually no. And the reason why is because the only piston on this side that's at the top of its travel is this number 1 piston right here. Numbers 3 and 5, they're further down. So even if the valves on number 3 and number 5 were to open, they would not contact the pistons. If the valves on number 1 here were to open, they would contact the pistons. However, if you notice where the lobes are at, we can actually rotate this quite a bit before the lobes try to open the valves. So we do have quite a bit of movement in these gears before the valves try to open. So we're gonna have plenty of space to be able to rotate this exhaust gear about not quite 90 degrees, actually a little bit less than that. And we'll be just fine because by that point, the lobes here on this exhaust cam, they're gonna be just barely starting to try to open the valves, but they won't be open yet. So we'll have plenty of clearance. Okay, we're in position now, and the reason it snapped like that was because there's spring tension. The lobes here for the intake valves on cylinder 3 were pressing down and opening up the valves, and then also these exhaust lobes on 5 were pointing down. So there was some spring tension on these cams, so that's why when I started rotating it, it jumped like that. But don't worry, no piston to valve contact has been made, so we're good. Even if we wanted to rotate this a little bit more, we could, and there wouldn't be any piston to valve contact. But right here, we're okay. So if the engine jumps a little bit like that, don't worry, you haven't damaged anything. But now we'll be able to actually get this chain off. And actually, with this primary chain removed, you can get a lot better view of the timing marks. The bank 2 mark is etched into the sprocket here. It's the wider line. The bank 1 timing mark is etched into the sprocket here. It's the narrower line. And then this mark is just indicating that this one here is for bank 1. And these 2 marks here are just indicating that this mark here is for bank 2. Just to reiterate that. So now I'm gonna go ahead and remove both the intake and exhaust cam gears on both banks. Actually, I almost forgot. Let me retract this tensioner. That way it'll be a lot easier to pull off. Now to retract this tensioner is very simple. All you do is, if you notice here on the bank 1 side in the very bottom, there's a small hole right here where I'm sticking this little pin. Kind of hard to see, but as you can see, the pin goes in. So there's a hole right there in the plastic part. So I'm just gonna take a small pin like this. So I'm simply gonna press up on the chain with my hand. It's really not that hard. Then I'm gonna put the pin in the hole here. And that's it. Now the chain has plenty of slack to get these gears off. On the bank 1 side, that pin goes in through the bottom. But over here on the bank 2 side, the little hole to insert the pin is right there on the top. And while I'm here, I might as well retract this tensioner for the chain on bank 2 as well. So I'm gonna press down. Keep going, there we go. Once all the oil pressure is released out of it, it'll be all the way down. I'm gonna take the pin, stick it in the hole. And that's it. Now I've got slack in this chain too. Well, I had a little bit of slack anyway because this guide is broken. Okay, so now let me kind of come back to where I was over here and get these gears off. Slide them out together. That's it. While I'm here, I'm gonna go ahead and pop out this 12mm bolt up here, and I'm gonna get this tensioner off. just a single 12mm bolt like this, and the tensioner comes out. Because of the deep grooves that are worn in the guide here, I'm gonna go ahead and replace this as well, because I definitely don't want to put it back together and then have this guide break just like the other one broke on the other side, because this is a heck of a job to have to do twice. Okay, I'm gonna do the same thing now over here on bank 2. There we go. Now actually, while all this is apart and there's no chains or gears obstructing you, now is actually the perfect time to clean off your timing cover. That way it's ready for the fresh silicone once the job's finally done and you got all the timing chains on. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that. Don't forget about this gasket right here. Make sure that you replace this before you put the timing cover back on. This is actually an oil passage, so oil from the oil pump gets pumped through the timing cover and into this hole right here into the rest of the engine. So you do not want a leak here, because then your oil pressure will be low. Okay, so I've got my engine cleaned off where all the old silicone was, so I'm pretty much ready for new silicone. I got the timing cover cleaned off as well. So let's take a look at our new parts and get this thing timed correctly. Okay, so the decision has been made here to actually replace all 4 of these VVT gears, which is probably the best thing, to be honest. So I'll go ahead and time the bank 1 side first, and then we'll do bank 2. So once again, remember, both intake and both exhaust gears, they are the same, so it doesn't matter which bank you put them on. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to start with bank 1, flip them over. And if you'll notice on the intake gear, there are these dots here that correspond with bank 1 and bank 2. And these dots here, they're also in line with the markings up here for bank 1 and for bank 2. And then same thing on the exhaust gear, we have there's no markings here, but you can easily see the lines here for bank 1 and for bank 2. So we're going to take the chain, and remember, these chains on both sides are the same, so it doesn't matter really which one goes where. But since we're doing bank 1, we're going to line up the yellow mark with the dot for bank 1 on the intake gear, and then we're going to line up the yellow mark on the exhaust side with this single line here for bank 1. So you're going to get that in there. As you can see on the intake side, we're lined up with that single dot, and if you flip it over here, we're exactly in line with our mark for bank 1. On the exhaust side, we're in line with our mark for bank 1 as well. So this is ready to be installed on the bank 1 side. So we'll set this to the side here. And now we're going to do the bank 2 side, and it's basically going to be the same process. The only difference is, because it's bank 2, we're going to need to swap these over like that. Because remember, we're kind of looking at it from the back side of the motor looking forward. So bank 2, you want to put your gears this way with the intake gear on the right side. So we have our 2 dots here for bank 2. We have our 2 notches here for bank 2. We're going to line up the yellow colored links accordingly. So we're going to put this one on the 2 dots. And when we do that, notice how it lines up with these 2 dots, and then also it's in line with this fat mark right here for bank 2. Now we're going to get our exhaust gear on. We're going to line up the yellow paint mark with the 2 notches for bank 2. Okay, that's it. So we're all lined up with our marks here for bank 2. So now this one's ready to go on bank 1, this one's ready to go on bank 2. So let's go ahead and get them on there. Okay, before we get our gears on, let's go ahead and get these tensioners installed. Kind of a glare, but you can see the R right there. So they are labeled left and right. Right is for bank 1, so we're going to get this one installed on bank 1. And our tensioner that has the L on it is going to go on the bank 2 side over here. Snug these down. And these bolts, they get torqued to 15 foot-pounds. Okay, bank 1. Let's get our bank 1 gears on there. Now remember, we got to line up our dowel pins here. So make sure the chain goes over either side of the tensioner. And just rotate the gears until it fits in place. Like so. Now remember, these cams right here, in order for us to get the chain off earlier, we had to rotate them clockwise quite a bit. So of course the gears will have to be rotated clockwise to get it to line up with the dowel pins. Once we get ready to put the main chain on, then we'll rotate them back counterclockwise to where they're supposed to be. But for now, this is fine. Let's get our 2 bolts started. I'm not going to torque them quite yet. I'm just going to snug them down for now, and then we'll torque them later at the end. Same thing over here on the bank 2 side. Okay, got those in, so let's get these bolts snug down here. Now let me go ahead and get this new guide installed while I'm here. Now these two 12mm bolts, they get torqued to 17 foot-pounds. Now remember, when you go to install the new chain, the 2 orange colored links, they go onto the cam gears, and then the yellow colored link goes onto the crank. So I'm gonna come over here first. I'm gonna slide my chain in and get that orange colored link lined up with the mark for bank 1 over here. Okay, so I'm just gonna leave it like that for now. So the way it's currently set up at the moment, there's a lot of slack right here in the middle part of the chain, which is actually, that's good for right now. Once I rotate these cams counterclockwise, it'll take a lot of the slack out. It'll put the slack down at the bottom so we can slip it over the crank gear, which is what we're gonna want here in a minute. Now, very important before we proceed, so pay attention to this. This idler gear right here, if you happen to take it off or replace it, the torque spec is 44 foot-pounds. But besides that, I'm actually not replacing this because there's really no reason to. They don't go bad. There's nothing wrong with it. But if you notice on this gear, this black part is actually kind of a hard rubber material on either side of the teeth of the gear. It's got this black hard rubber. And if you notice, this is actually, when this gear is new, it's kind of round, but over time what happens is the links on the chain, they wear these little grooves into that black rubber where the chain sits. So if you notice, you'll see those little groove marks as I rotate it. You see kind of right there, you see right there. So what happens is, if you're reusing the old gear, you need to pay attention and you need to make sure that the chain fits back in those grooves exactly where it was. For example, let me put it up here just as an example so you guys can see. So the outer links of the chains, they fit in the grooves that they've worn into this gear. So as you can see right there, it seats down perfectly. So this is correct. However, let's rotate it one tooth over and let's watch what happens here. Let's get the outer links of the chain to be not in the grooves. And you notice what happens? The chain doesn't seat fully on the gear. And if we rotate it over, let's rotate it one tooth over on the gear. And see there, it seats down fully as it should. So please pay attention to that. Make sure that the outer edges of these links fit into the grooves that they've already worn into this gear. Because if you don't pay attention to that and you end up getting it to where it's like this and it doesn't seat properly, then you can end up at the very end, you get this whole job back together, you get everything done, and you might end up with the check engine light coming on with timing codes. So please pay attention to that. Don't just slap it together. So now with it like that, I'll go ahead and rotate these cam phasers counterclockwise and take the slack out of this part of the chain, and then I'll end up with more slack down here and I'll be able to finish putting the chain on. I guess I'll go ahead and pull the pin for this little tensioner here in between the two cam phasers. Pull the other one too. And now there is a spot on this intake cam where you can actually fit a crescent wrench. I'm gonna put that here and I'm gonna rotate this. And actually I almost forgot, let me put these two guides in real quick before I take the slack out of this chain here. Okay, now I'm gonna kind of hold this in place. I'm gonna hold the chain on the idler gear and then rotate the cam to take the slack out of the chain here. Like that. Okay, my chain is still good here on the idler gear. Now all my slack is on the bottom of the chain, which is exactly where I want it to be. I'm gonna slide this sprocket back out here. And if you notice, my yellow link here needs to be lined up with that dot on the crank gear. So I'm actually not quite in the right position. Instead of moving the cams, I'm actually just gonna move the crank a little bit counterclockwise. The reason is because this engine, now that I have these chains on, it's gonna be a little jumpy. If I start moving the cams, then the valve spring pressure is gonna force it to move too much to one side or another, and it'll be kind of hard to get it lined up. So I'm just gonna put the crank bolt in here, tighten it just a little bit, and then rotate the crank counterclockwise. Right there. Okay, at this point, pretty much all my slack in the chain is over here on this side, which is where you want it. So I'm gonna get my last guide installed here. I'm gonna stick this right here on this pin. And let me get my tensioner in and we'll be good to go here. Now these two 10mm bolts, they get torqued to 7 foot-pounds. Now before I pull the pin, I'm just gonna try to get as much of the slack over here as I can. As you can see right here, there's some slack. Okay, I've taken out the slack, and as you can see now, it's all on here, over here on this side. So all the slack's over here now. So I'm gonna do one more check on my marks and make sure I'm good before I pull the pin. Let me pull the pin here. I'm gonna rotate this a little bit more to where it's supposed to be, and then I'll show you what I've got. Gotta go a little bit clockwise. And of course, the last thing left to do here is to torque all of our cam phaser bolts, and they're gonna get torqued to 74 foot-pounds each. All right, so let's review before we close this out. So down here, you can see our yellow mark is lined up with the dot on the gear. So we're good there. Over here on bank 2, our 2 yellowed links are lined up with the notches on the cam caps here. So we're good. They're also lined up. As you can see, that yellow link is in line with the mark for bank 2. And then our yellow link on the intake cam gear is lined up with our fat mark for bank 2 right there, which is also where our orange colored link happens to land. So we're good over here. And then if you come over to bank 1, same thing here. Our yellow links on the secondary chain are lined up with those notches on the cam caps, both sides. And now remember, they're not going to perfectly line up, but this is totally fine. This is perfectly fine. So now come over here, our intake cam gear, yellow link here, you follow it up, and perfectly in line with the yellow link is our orange link on the main chain, which is lined up with our mark for bank 1. And over here on our exhaust gear, once again, our yellow mark on the chain is lined up with the single notch here on the gear for bank 1. So that's pretty much all there is to it, guys. And then once again, we're gonna double check and make sure that our chain is in the right position on the idler gear. This is only important if you're reusing the idler gear. If you have a little bit of slack in the chain at some points here, or even down here on the secondary chain, don't worry about that. That's totally normal. As soon as you crank the engine up, the oil pressure will force the tensioners to come out and take up all the slack in the chain, so that's perfectly fine. Once again, don't forget to replace this gasket here. I'll leave a part number here in the video for you. And one other thing, just make sure right here in the corners where the cylinder head meets the block, clean those out really well, because these are the points that tend to leak if you don't clean it really well and apply the sealer correctly. So thanks for watching, guys, and as soon as I get this job done, I'll throw a little clip on the end of this video of the engine running so you guys can see that everything turned out fine. Okay, so I'm fast forwarding in time here. It's now sometime later. I finally got the engine back in the car here, as you can see. And also, as you can see, there's still a few more things to put on, the wiper blades and the cowling and the engine covers and a few other little things. I still have to reconnect the front suspension. However, I can't wait any longer. I really want to get this thing fired up. That way you guys can hear the engine run, and then I'll shut it off and put everything, finish putting everything back together. Anyway, so I put oil, coolant, everything. So let's go in the car and start it up. So this will be the official first start. Get in here. As you can see, I had to take the glove box out to get to the wiring for the computer, so I still got to put that back in. I just really want to hear this thing start and run. Okay. I'm pretty nervous because if I did anything wrong, then I guess I'll catch it on camera. This is the actual, put it in park. This is the actual first start here. And if this thing does blow up when I start it, then I guess I'll have to change the title of this video to how not to change your timing chain, and then you'll know what not to do. All right, let's crank it. Sounds good so far. All right, let's go check it out. She's running. A little smoke because I had some oil spilled on some of the exhaust pipes, so it's gonna have a little bit of smoke, but it sounds pretty good though. All right, so I'm fast forwarding in time. Once again, I got the suspension reconnected and wipers and everything. There's still a few little covers here under the hood to put back on, but check it out. The engine's running real smooth, real quiet, no codes. This thing runs great. So now you guys have proof that the timing was done correctly. So if you guys need any help with the timing chain on one of these engines on the 2GR-FE, then just watch this video and follow all the steps that I outlined, and you guys shouldn't have any trouble. So thanks for watching. If you guys have any questions, feel free to post them in the comments below. Otherwise, have a great day, and I will see you guys on the next repair. Thank you guys so much. Bye.